You don't need bio. Okay. Well, I'm happy I could riff for Asha. I wouldn't be able to tell biography. Other than that, from really feeling This is really nice to pass around.
Yeah.
Just for Q&A. Just for Q&A.
I think so too.
Okay. If he wants that, I mean, there's really no main thing.
I may have
Okay.
that might work better than the three with ladies.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. And this is fine for them. That's fine. Okay. And then this is your mic, correct? This is your mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if you like that exactly where it is, but it's up to you.
It works.
Okay. It's actually fine with me.
We're gonna have the panel sit there while we learn your lesson.
For the, that's only the thing, right?
Yeah. A weird bit of mics, or is there mics or nothing?
And that one was so.
I'm gonna roll report now.
Oh, you wanna do it?
Gordon left it in the back of the room and it's all
Hi everybody, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, so find your seats if you haven't. Looks like there may be a couple of refreshments back in the room already, so help yourself. In case you didn't hear that, we're going to start in just a couple of minutes, so please take your seats. All right, let's get started. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Gordon Douglas. I'm an assistant professor in urban and regional planning here at San Jose State University, and I'm also the director of something called the Institute for Metropolitan Studies. And we are just one of many sponsors of this event tonight. So I want to start by pointing out all of the different groups that have kind of worked together to make this evening happen. We're really excited to have an evening conversation about this really important new report that has come out of LA Metro and Fair and Piers down in Los Angeles about understanding how women travel. The plan for the evening is that we'll have a short presentation about some transportation issues here in San Jose, followed by a presentation about the report itself, and then plenty of time for questions and discussion. So please get your questions in mind. I want to say that this event, in addition to LA Metro and Fair and Piers, who helped produce this report and have been great partners in organizing this event with us, this event is brought to you by the Mineta Transportation Institute here in San Jose, as well as SJSU's own Department of Urban and Regional Planning and the Institute for Metropolitan Studies, and our friends at SPUR, who, as you probably know, now have offices in San Jose and Oakland in addition to San Francisco. So check out SPUR for more events like this. Thanks to them also for advertising this. without further ado, we're going to have eventually 3 panelists sitting up here. That's going to include Elba Higueros, the Chief Policy Officer at LA Metro, and Chelsea Richer, an Associate and Deputy Office Leader of the Los Angeles Office of Fair and Peers. The 2 of them will be up here in a moment to present their report. And first, we're going to be joined by my colleague Asha Weinstein-Agarwal, who is a Professor of Urban Planning and also Director of Education at the Mineta Transportation Institute. So, without further ado, Asha, take it away. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Gordon, for the introduction, and MTI for inviting me to participate. I'm going to take just 5 minutes to give you a sort of tidbit of a research project that I'm just wrapping up, funded by MTI, that is really, you can think of it as a subset of the larger topic that we'll be hearing more about in a moment, which is the extent and impact of sexual harassment for women and men actually using transit, public transit. So I had the great pleasure of joining colleagues quite literally around the world, 6 continents. I think we're up to like 18 different cities. We all used the same survey with college students, asking them about sexual harassment when they're using public transit. Does it happen? Are you worried about it? Have you reported it? Does fear of harassment change the way you use transit? And it was a fairly extensive questionnaire that we all used essentially the same ones. So I will just talk a few things about San Jose State findings, but then also put them in a few sentences in the context of 18 cities and 6 continents. So here at San Jose State, we surveyed 891 of our students, undergrad and grad students, and it was an online survey. Students are wonderfully easy to catch because it's San Jose State, at least they always, and so let me just quickly run through some of the key findings. One is that sexual harassment is sadly a pretty common experience for people. It is not just something that happens to a few, and I'm not going to ask, but I'm guessing that many of you in the audience, if you use public transit at all, have had some sorts of uncomfortable experiences. We found that 63%, that's 63, of our respondents had experienced some type of harassment while taking public transit. Now, this varied widely. Much of this was what we might call verbal harassment, so being called baby or having someone ask to have sex with you, to things like people playing with your hair or groping you, stalking you, and then the most serious cases of assault. So, and I have to admit, I had seen other surveys, and so I shouldn't have been quite so surprised because I know it's a prevalent problem, but when I kind of got my own data back, it's up 63% of the people. It's clearly something that is, but let me leave it there. I also want to say we looked at differences between men and women, both in their experiences in harassment and how they respond to it. And one of the big takeaways for me is that I think harassment is often discussed as a woman's issue. And it was absolutely true that very roughly twice as many women as men had experienced different types of categories of harassment, but it was still a lot of men. So something like 40%, and I'm forgetting my exact number here, I think it was 40% of men had experienced some form of harassment. And so I actually think it's important to acknowledge this because I think sometimes problems get kind of written off if they're seen as a women's issue, and hopefully that's going to be changing. But also we have to acknowledge it's not just women's issue, men are also suffering from this. So a few other key things that we learned. We looked at people both on riding the bus and the train. And these are sort of in the downtown San Jose and coming to campus. There were somewhat higher reports of harassment for bus travel than train travel, but it was definitely a problem in both places. As I mentioned, verbal and the kind of non-verbal but not actually groping you kinds of problems were more common than physical, but over 10% of people said they had been subject to physical sexual harassment while using transit. Again, it's not a small number. We also asked if, another thing that actually I think is very important and that I want to highlight before I wrap up here is we asked people in different ways about have they experienced sexual harassment. And when we just sort of said very simply, have you experienced sexual harassment, far fewer people said no, or sorry, many people said no. I think it was something in the order of only, I think it was about 22% said, yes, I have experienced sexual harassment. But then we asked a long series of questions about specific behaviors. Have you had somebody whistle at you, call you baby, touch your hair, etc.? And when we kind of broke harassment, sexual harassment down into all those categories and saw who had experienced each of these, that is how we came to that larger number of people who had experienced it. And so one of the important takeaways for me is that we need to sort of collectively as a public, as planners, educate both ourselves and the public about what is sexual harassment and what things are really not okay and that you shouldn't have to be subject to. And just to use myself as an example, when I started this project, I thought, well, I've never been subject to sexual harassment using transit. And then as I started learning more and working on our survey, I went, you know, one of our categories is people masturbating in front of you. And I thought, oh, I was like 22. I was in Paris on a kind of Sunday morning and I went around a corner and there was a man masturbating. So I think the more we kind of think about it, we realize that it's a problem, not only that we're kind of not aware of how stark the numbers are, but that we need to really, as I said, educate ourselves about what are these behaviors that are threatening to people and not acceptable. And then I want to wrap up, but I'll just mention we did find large numbers of people saying I use transit less because I'm concerned about sexual harassment, or people very significantly limiting their travel, saying I won't travel at night, I won't wait at certain stops, I'll only wait in well-lit places. And then there were some other things people did that didn't necessarily limit their ability to get to the places they needed to go. But, you know, there were lots of people who carried keys to use as a weapon or mace and things like that. So, our study, I think, is a little dismal. It's more focused on the problem. But I think we have some recommendations, but I think those would probably be better coming from my fellow panelists. So I will wrap up here.
Good evening, I'm Melvin Garros, I'm the Chief Policy Officer at Cali Metro. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this conversation on our Helen and Travel study. So as students, you all understand the importance that transit plays and public transportation plays in communities. It provides access to jobs, access to education, access to health services, as well as access to social interactions. And so, and for riders that are transit dependent, public transportation serves an even more vital role. So, we're going to start with how we got to this How Women Travel study. And so in 2017, our CEO, Phil Washington, established the Women and Girls Governing Council. And this council is a group of 60 employees that meet on a monthly basis who apply a gender lens to Metro's policies and procedures, and they focus on 3 areas. One area is Metro as an employer, Metro as a service provider, and Metro as a catalyst for economic development. And so the council was, service provider council was looking to see how they developed their recommendation, and they were trying to gather data to see how women are using our system. And so what they found was that though we had a lot of data, we were not separating the data, and we were not using it in our planning process or in our service improvements, and found that we don't have enough data information. So that led them to a recommendation to our CEO to conduct this How Women Travel study, start gathering the data that we do have and getting more additional data to complete the story. So why did we do this study? We did this study to bring visibility to women's transportation needs and travel patterns. We can't have an equitable system without knowing how women are using our system, how their different travel patterns. We know that women use our system more in this previous slide. Of the 1.3 million daily trips on Metro, 54% of our Metro bus riders are female and 52% of our Metro rail riders are female. We know that women depend more on public transportation than men. We want to identify mobility barriers and challenges. We know that these challenges and barriers will impact how women use the system and the overall experience on our system, looking at safety, affordability, accessibility, and reliability. And we want to shift from a gender-neutral planning to gender-responsive planning. Traditionally, transportation is seen as it serves everybody equally, benefits women and men, and there's not a lot of difference. 9 to 5 commute, and that's when people generally use the system. But you'll find through these findings that that's not true. Also, women that are using the system differently have different differences that need to be understood so that we can have a gender inclusive system. And so we want to shift over to gender responsive planning where we consider women's travel patterns, needs, concerns, and priorities. And utilize gender specific data to ensure equitable outcomes in the planning and operation of our service. And so I will turn it over to Chelsea, who from Fair and Pierce, and their team did an outstanding job of being creative and developing a really comprehensive approach to gathering this data.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. So, like Elva said, we were really thrilled to work on this project. We had a fantastic team of consultants working with us. We had a great team of women from our Los Angeles Fair and Pierce office. We also had a group called Pueblo Planning, which is a participatory planning firm. They are based out of Los Angeles, Southern California, I think San Diego. They do some work all over the Southern California region. And we had some researchers from UCLA also joining our team to help really look through and make sure all of the survey instruments we were using were valid and that the data collection processes we were about to embark on were going to produce really useful information for Metro. So we took a pretty broad approach to answering the question, how do women travel? And I'm going to go through in some detail tonight. This is a university setting, so I assume that you're all really excited to hear about data collection methods and all of the the great research tools that we used. So I'm not going to spare any detail on that, but I'll keep moving. So like Elva said, we had a lot of existing data to work with before we even thought about what data we would need to collect. We did a literature review, so we looked at all the academic and peer-reviewed research that's out there. There's tons available, particularly around issues of sexual harassment and safety. We looked at all of Metro's internal data, which much of it had never been disaggregated by gender. Much of it didn't have gender as a variable, so we weren't able to disaggregate it, but a lot of it did. So we really were starting from a rich basis there. We also looked to the National Household Travel Survey and the California Household Travel Survey. Is everyone in this room familiar with those two data sources? I'm seeing some nodding heads. Yeah. So as you know, as many of you probably know, that's a travel diary-based data source. The National Household Travel Survey is, of course, collected on a national basis. California took the step of oversampling in the last round of the National Household Travel Survey, which was in 2017. So we have a really robust data set from 2017, which is pretty recent. And then the California Household Travel Survey asks questions in a slightly different way, and the most recent update to that was 2012. So we really used that just to fill any gaps that weren't able to be answered through the National Household Travel Survey. And that data source is really rich. You can look at questions related to the trip. So what mode are you taking? Where are you going? How long does the trip take? You can ask questions about the traveler. So things like gender are really prominent there. We can also ask, other things about the household structure, whether they have kids in the household, whether they're married or head of household or not head of household. And then you can also even look at things like the vehicle, model and make, and how old it is. And we didn't we weren't able to get into that level of granularity for this study, but it is a really deep data source that offers a lot of insight into a lot of questions that we care about. So we were able to do a pretty robust survey collection of all of those existing data before we looked into collecting new data. And really what we wanted to do was use our new data collection methods when we were out there collecting primary data to fill in the gaps that we knew wouldn't be available, or to really amplify the voices that we knew wouldn't be heard from all of the existing data sets. So we looked at some conventional methods. We did some focus groups. We did a web survey. We sampled 2,600 people. We oversampled women. We made sure that we were getting broad swaths of the Southern California region, anyone who might be reasonably within Metro's service area. And our focus groups were both conducted in English and Spanish. We conducted 2 with women and 1 with men. So some conventional methods, but really focusing in on the questions that weren't really being asked in any of the other data sources, that really were drilling down to the reasons why women might be traveling differently than men. And then in order to amplify some of those voices that we knew would be missing from those sort of conventional methods and all of the existing methods, we looked towards a participatory planning model and really leaned on the ethnographic field of study and inquiry. And we developed a participant observation method, and we also rolled out participatory workshops, and finally we rolled out pop-ups. So the goal with the participant observation was to really capture some of the expressed behaviors that people might say, as Asha said, like, I've never been sexually harassed. You might not even realize that you're doing something in a particular way or behaving in a particular way while riding transit. But maybe there's gender differences there that are sort of expressed preferences or revealed preferences versus stated preferences. The participatory workshops were really aimed to amplify voices that we knew just wouldn't be captured from the other methods. So we particularly focused in on women with disabilities, who comprise such a small sample of the general public that if we were to sample, 26,000 people, we might be able to get a sample size large enough to really be able to make any kind of finding about women with disabilities. Same with women experiencing homelessness. There's also an access issue for women experiencing homelessness to even be able to take a web-based survey. And then immigrant women who are in Southern California raising their kids, really part of the transit-dependent and most loyal cohort of people who ride Metro services. But again, might not be really interested in taking a government survey or coming to a focus group downtown, or have any real time to spare if they're not already being asked these questions in spaces where they're already occupying. So we came to these groups in the participatory workshops, and I'll speak a little bit more about how we did that as well. And then the pop-ups, we did 3 at rush hour at major transfer locations, just to kind of get everyone as they're passing through, really simple questions, and really just trying to get real riders where they are without some complicated survey, but really just sort of gut reaction to a question, what makes your ride easy and what makes your ride hard. So I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. The Metro data that we were able to look to included the onboard survey. Metro does an incredibly robust data collection effort twice a year on their buses and their trains. So we had a really good historical picture of some of those questions and how it changed over time. So we were able to look at some of that and present that in the findings section. The customer complaint and tracking system is every customer complaint that comes into Metro's system. It doesn't collect gender as a variable for that, but what it does have is a Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. sort of honorary term that's in there. So we took a little bit of a liberty and assigned gender based on those terms that were used, recognizing that might not be 100% accurate all the time. We did clean it, so if there were very obvious missing gender terms in there, we wouldn't have included those. But again, that's a really robust historical data set, so we thought the value of looking at that was really worth the potential validity concerns or the need to remove some of the sort of most obvious cases. The Metro crime reports we looked to didn't have gender either. However, as Asha said, we know that there's a disproportionate amount of sexual harassment that affects women. So we really thought it was important to really dig into that sexual harassment and sexual assault data in there, recognizing again that it's not 100% able to make some gender claims with that data, but we were able to really dig into that important data set that exists. We also looked at fare evasion citation, bus, and then a handful of surveys that Metro has done on sort of a one-off basis, just for part of their other planning processes. Many of those surveys did contain gender as variable, but just had never been disaggregated that way before. As I mentioned, the National Household Travel Survey, I spoke quite a lot about this already, so I won't dwell on it too much longer, but we have trip characteristics, personal characteristics, and then household characteristics, and really able to get at a lot of those underlying pattern differences through that data set. And it's broad, so it covers all modes, which means that transit mode is going to be a little underrepresented in that data set. So we use our survey as sort of the gap fill to really focus on transit riders in particular, to address any sample size concerns with using this data set, which looks at all modes, 80% of which are in a vehicle. We also did an online survey, and as I mentioned, we oversampled women. Here are just some of the demographic statistics about our survey sample, if you can read that from where you are. We tried to balance to really make sure that we were capturing different income levels that reflect Metro's ridership, different race and ethnicities that reflect Metro's ridership, different age brackets that reflect Metro's ridership and the general public. And then we asked questions about transit use frequency so that we knew we were oversampling transit riders and we were able to get a robust sample for that. We also did the 3 focus groups, as I mentioned. Again, we asked questions about income, ethnicity and race, age, and transit use frequency. For focus groups that have 10 to 12 people in them, it's not intended to be a quantitative sample size that's truly representative of the population. It's more of a qualitative method to really inform and sort of contextualize some of the things that we were able to draw out of the quantitative analysis that we were doing. So not as much of a concern here in getting a robust and sort of purely representative sample, as much as we just wanted to make sure that we weren't completely omitting any particular category, or at least if we were aware of what those limitations were. So some of the quotes that we heard from the focus groups, I'll go into a couple of the things that we heard, were really fascinating and really helped inform what kinds of questions we wanted to dig into on our survey. So we asked about what time of day women stop riding transit. We didn't even hardly have to ask this question. It was offered very just openly, and it definitely tracks with some of the findings that Asha shared as well. People have a sort of mental cutoff time, and after 8:30 or 9 o'clock, that's about my limit. And then I don't take the train anymore, and I'll find another way to get home, whether it be Lyft or having someone come get me. We heard a lot about people relying on friends and family for rides, as well as really using Lyft and Uber to sort of supplement their normal transit pattern usage. We also heard a lot about the service differences between weekdays and weekends, and how if they're trying to run a lot of errands on the weekend when they're not working, that's incredibly difficult to do on transit just because the service tends to taper off on weekends. And then of course we heard a lot about safety as well, and just sort of the general feeling that women are always at risk purely because we are women, and that it's sort of an inescapable facet of our lives in public space. So to go a little bit more deeply into the innovative methods that we used, the qualitative data that we collected, we really looked to cover as much of the Los Angeles region as possible. Is anyone in here from LA or familiar with LA? A couple of people. Okay, great. Well, it's a great place to visit. I highly recommend it. And on this map on the side of the screen here shows many of the bus routes that you can take when you come to visit. And all of the buses and trains that we were able to collect data on, either through participant observation or through our pop-up and our participatory workshops. We asked what lines people use most often, so we were able to see sort of the geographic span that we were able to capture through these methods. This is on the left-hand side of the screen is the participant observation sort of data collection form that we developed, where we have some notes that we were able to take, circle things like amenities at the bus stop and how fully occupied the bus was at the time that we were collecting. You can see on the right-hand side, we collected over 2,000 individual observations about things that were happening on the buses. We were out there collecting data for over 100 hours, and we wrote at all times of the day and night. An overnight owl service where there was owl service that existed. We rode many of the most heavily ridden lines and really aimed for a sort of geographic spread here to make sure that we were able to identify whether there were any geographic differences or sort of universal observations that were happening all over the county regardless of geography. And then finally, the participatory workshops. We focused on these 3 marginalized groups that really don't get captured in most traditional data collection methods. And we know that that's a big gap in a lot of the research methods that a lot of us rely on. So we focused in particular on women with disabilities, women experiencing homelessness, and women who are immigrants and with varying documentation statuses. So we heard a lot about cost of travel and burden of caring for yourself and also bringing your 3 children on the bus with you. We heard a lot about confusion related to child fares. We heard a lot from women experiencing homelessness about how much of a lifeline metro services are, not just for transit and getting around, but also because it's an extension of public space, and in many cases, the place where they felt safest to be. So really a lot of moving personal stories through these workshops, and just some incredible contextualized observations that we were able to make through those conversations. And as you can see in the photos, we didn't have people in a room like this and talk with them for an hour. We actually really relied on an art making and sort of story sharing method. And so we had folks take bits and pieces of things that we collected and sort of brought into the space. Some of them were imagery. We had a bunch of emojis. People loved the emojis with like the smiley face or the crying face. And really just offered time to respond to the question, what comes to mind when you think about riding transit? And people, created these incredible 3-dimensional things that they were then able to tell stories about and share with the group. And it was just a much different way of collecting information, collecting qualitative stories than many of the methods we typically rely on. And so I would highly encourage anyone to use this method. Really gets people sort of comfortable in talking in a way that just, even in the focus group, another qualitative method, it's just a totally different environment when you're making art and cutting out pictures and pasting things on the board with your kids. So the other thing that we did was the pop-ups, and as I mentioned, we held those at 3 transfer heavy bus to rail stations. And we were there during rush hour, and we talked to lots of folks in there, and those were sort of like facilitated comment card type data collection where we just asked simple questions and listened a lot to the stories that people were sharing. And following all of this data synthesis and analysis and collection and then reanalysis, we pulled it all together and generated some findings for Metro. And so I'll pass it back to Elba to talk more about those.
Through all the research and the data collection, we categorized them into these 6 areas. So I'm going to go briefly through them. It is a 200-page study, so we're just going to touch on the highlights. So as you can see from this sheet right there, that women tend to make more combined and frequent trips, often for shorter distances. For multiple purposes within one journey, taking children and trip chaining. Women make 7 or more trips per day, and more women make 0 trips per day. And this is the overall travel behavior. This is not just on transit. And women are more likely to live in car-free or car-light households, as well as 61% of women's trips on all modes are 10 miles or less. And overall transit behavior, as I mentioned before, 54% of our riders are women. The interesting part of this is this section right here. So most transit agencies are seeing a decline in ridership, as Metro is. But the interesting part is that women, their ridership continues to increase while men's ridership is decreasing. So that was a really insightful information that we got from the study. The top reasons for women riding transit in LA region is that they don't have a car to avoid traffic, or they don't have a driver's license. And they're more likely to travel during the day, from 12 to 4. And 57% of female riders are traveling with children. So safety, personal safety, physical safety, and sexual harassment on public transportation is obviously a significant concern, and I'd be very interested to hear more about your findings. And so it was a top concern across all the data source, and it really complicates women's travel. Through the qualitative data that Chelsea gathered, we we understood a little bit more about how women's travel behaviors are changed, because of safety. They change how they dress, they change what time they travel, they change what they carry. So a lot of their behavior is altered based on their concerns for safety, and when they ride and if they ride at all. Here's top changes that would make current and previous female riders feel safer. Current female riders felt safer with transit police nearby, lighting, and other people nearby, and previous female riders with other people nearby, security cameras and lighting. And this is the important part of having the qualitative data and the quantitative data, because when in our participatory workshops, we heard that though it's not really security that they want, as in law enforcement, they just want presence. Somebody of authority, whether it be a bus operator, somebody maybe cleaning the facilities, someone there that would help and direct them. And so we also focused on accessibility and vehicle design. You can imagine boarding a bus with 2 children, holding a stroller, trying to pay the fare, and then trying to navigate through this vehicle that's either crowded or not. It's quite an endeavor. So we recognize that women tend to travel with bags and carts and strollers, and 80% of complaints related to strollers are made by women. And when we look at it, they agree transit is comfortable. Only 37% agreed with that. So, and then also in terms of accessibility, we talk about affordability. Women who ride metro are living in poverty at a higher rate. The median household income for female bus riders was $16,000 compared to men at $19,000. And so, and also they are 59% below the federal poverty level. And so, when we look at how they're paying for their fare, 30% of women are still paying their fare with cash, even though we have monthly passes and weekly passes. And again, through some of the participatory workshops and focus groups, we realized that our programs, our female riders are still having difficulty paying the upfront costs for these discounts and are bearing this additional financial burden of not only getting themselves to where they need to go, but also their family members. Some of the information we also identified was that women are not only traveling with children, but they're also traveling with other people that are dependent for their care. Then we'll move on to reliability and frequency, the frequency of service and pass-ups. The top 3 complaints received by female bus riders was pass-ups, no-show, and late schedule. And when we look at this, we think about what does it mean to be passed up. It could mean increase in childcare costs. It could mean the loss of a job. It could mean other impacts because of not having that reliability or frequency to get to where you need to get. Another thing that we noticed was that also that overcrowded buses, if the buses aren't frequent enough, can also lend to an environment of more sexual harassment. And then convenience and comfort. 3/4 of women transit trips are less than 10 miles, but 44% of those trips take 60 minutes or more. Again, and 45% of female bus and 57% of rail riders transfer during their trips. And so with all of these findings, what we found is that we need to develop a gender action plan to help look further into these areas and opportunities and strategies to make improvements. And we are currently working on getting that gender action plan started. So with that concludes my portion, and I guess we'll have questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much for those presentations. So yeah, now we're going to open up the floor to questions. I also have a short list of questions that were submitted by some of you online. I'm going to ask the panelists to sit down over there where there are a couple of microphones. You know, and I'm just gonna start off with one question for myself, as everybody gets kind of situated there are mics that will be passed around if you raise your hand, so please wait for the microphone, before you start asking a question for the sake of the camera or something. So thank you guys very much, this is a wonderful presentation and super interesting findings and really important, I think, to have that kind of wealth of data. And one of the things that's most striking to me, from the beginning to the end on just every page of data that you're showing, are also just the differences in responses between women and men. So it's really interesting that you had some responses from men in there as a kind of point of comparison. And so kind of to that end, why is so much of the available data not inclusive of gender as a variable, or as a category, so that you guys are having to kind of make all these assumptions and, you know, clean the data to try to make it work or whatever. And I'm curious just why, and whether that's something that at least LA Metro, since it is you, might work to change in future onboard surveys or things like that, now that we know how kind of important it is to make these decisions based on that.
Yeah, I think the first step that Metro has taken with this study really demonstrates that we're trying to change how we design and operate and plan for our infrastructure and services that we have. We can't do it without this data, and so through this study we're recognizing the importance of this data. And it's not just for women. There's older adults that we need to gather more data on, people with disabilities that we need to gather more data on, people of different incomes that we need to gather more data. So I think this is just an opportunity for us to recognize how important it is and how it needs to be weaved into everything we do. And one of my first slides, where we traditionally, and not just Metro, but most transit agencies, are just designing a system that works, where we think it works for everybody. Everyone's going to work at the same time, everyone's using it the same way, and so we're just trying to change how we plan and the way we look at it.
Yeah.
I'll just add that it's not just a transit issue. I think while we were doing the study, the book Invisible Women was released, and that I haven't read it all the way through, but I've read many excerpts, and it seems to be a pervasive problem in many industries where there's just the assumption that if you make this thing, it's going to work the same for everybody, and that's over and over just proving not to be true. So I think it's a thing that many industries are grappling with, and really commendable that our transit industry and Metro is leading the charge on that.
I agree very much what was just said. One thing that's interesting, and I'll kind of throw this back also as a question at you, I think there are a couple of problems. One is an assumption that everybody's the same, and so we don't need to look at different categories. But actually, I think there's also a lot of resistance to looking at gender. I think there's more of an acceptance that if you have a disability or you're low income, your experience is different. Now, I'm not saying these groups aren't frequently ignored, but there's more people who are kind of like, oh, okay, I see. Whereas I think that there's traditionally a lot of resistance to even being willing to look, and just chatting with students and professionals over the years. I have a lot of people very definitively say we shouldn't take gender into account. Like, it's not appropriate. It's not that they don't think it even matters, maybe it does or doesn't, but it's not appropriate. So I'm really interested, Elba, if you could share with us, how did Metro kind of come to make this really major commitment to looking at gender?
This was a result of our CEO. So by establishing the Women and Girls Governing Council, that was the first step to send the message to Metro that gender is important. And I'll step away a little bit in terms of, is it important? It's important that we have a very diverse workforce so that these conversations do happen. I think diversity of thought is very important, so you need to have everybody at the table to have these conversations, and so it's again weaved into the culture of the work. And so that's what I'll say. Our CEO is doing an outstanding job at LA Metro, and it was really as a result of the council that he established.
All right, anybody out there in the audience with a question, please raise your hand and somebody with a microphone will come to you.
Hi, my question is, so how does policing, Metro Police work, and if it's effective or not? Because like here in BART, you have like this tension with the BART police because of Fruitville, because of the recent murders on there. So like, how does that get into play? You know, with the racial tension and the police tension.
In regards to this study, this was the first step of many additional steps that we have to take. And so that's why through our gender action plan, we're going to focus on these key areas, safety being one of them, and look at strategies and different ways of approaching the issue of safety. Like I said, in the report, 2/3 of women said that they wanted to see an increase in law enforcement. But through a lot of the conversations with community, we heard that it's not necessarily policing that they want to see, they just want to have a presence there. So with this study, we're working closely with our security office to see what kind of strategies we can implement to make sure that people are feeling safe on our system and addressing the other concerns. That answers your question.
And this is looking more specifically at safety when it comes to harassment, but I think that in addition, having more other people, whether they're police, bus drivers, or others, or just other passengers, helps a great deal and makes people feel safer. But I think that, first of all, getting people to report, like we have no idea how many people report. Like in our survey, something like 11% of people said they had reported harassment, and it wasn't usually to the police or the transit authority, it was to their friend or their family member. And even and I won't say what agency, because that's not the point here, chatting with somebody in the Bay Area who was pointing at, and I said, well, how would you report sexual harassment? And the person said, oh, we have an app. You know, and he pulls it out and realizes like, oh, there's not really a category that would fit under. So I think part of it is encouraging people to report, and part of that is just making it possible to report at all. The other thing I'll say is, in the course of doing this work, I've had a chance to hear from people working at transit agencies around the country and around the world, and there are some, and I'm sure they're not the only, but the ones I happen to know about, that are quite amazingly proactive, and I'll just give a quick story or two. So somebody from WMATA, the Washington, D.C. subway service, they have their own transit police, which helps. Does Metro have your own transit police or not? Sort of. Okay. And that seems to make, from what I've seen, a big difference between whether the police is like within the transit agency or it's a cooperation between just, you know, the regular city or county sheriffs. But where they were wide, so WMATA was very, very widely advertising, you know, signs, educational campaigns reported if you see it. And one of the things I think that a lot of people feel is like, well, what's the point of reporting it? I'm on some crowded train at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Yeah, right. I tell them that I got groped. How's anything ever gonna happen? And I think that it was actually surprising to me. I was thinking those very same things and listening to this, and it was like the chief of their police very carefully talking about like, no, we have cameras in pretty much, in this case, every train car, and we go back and we look at them and we can often identify the person. And then Asha or others think, well, yeah, fine, you see some random, it's usually a man, not always, you know, man, how are you ever going to find the person? And the police chief was explaining, like, well, first of all, a lot of people have pretty regular travel patterns. So if we can look on the same line, the same day, whatnot, to see if we can find that person. And they even post sort of person wanted posters at stations. You know, they have a picture from the cameras. They will literally post it and say, do you know who this is? And they have identified and arrested people. So it's a lot of work, but I think that if we can help people, make it easy for them to report it and also let them know that something will actually happen if they take that step, it could over time really help the situation.
Yeah, I'll quickly mention at Elementary, we're going to start a bystander campaign. Because sometimes you don't know you're being sexually harassed, but I may know you're being sexually harassed, and I can have the opportunity to also report it and make sure we get that data. Oops, sorry.
I'll just add, we heard a couple of interesting, like, nuanced takes on this question, and definitely a lot of concern that while we want to be increasing safety and feelings and perceptions of safety for a population of women riding the transit system, we don't want to be creating new impacts through over-policing. But we did hear a lot of women and men both, reflecting that they were experiencing something and no one spoke up, like none of the other passengers spoke up around them. So I think things like the bystander campaign are a really good start to that. We also heard a lot about, the frustration that a bus operator might not be interacting or intervening soon enough in a situation. But then a lot of sort of the other flip side of that, where we heard a lot of folks saying, but I get it, their job is to get us from point A to point B safely, so it really can't all fall on the bus operator. So maybe there is a role for another person on the bus or another person on the transit system that's not a police officer, not responsible for actually operating the bus, but someone who's more of like a transit ambassador who can provide that authoritative presence without actually being armed or having the authority to arrest or create sort of a record in a criminal justice way for someone. So I think some of those findings are reported in the study in a little bit more nuance than we were able to cover tonight. And I think it provides hopefully some good fuel for conversation within Metro, just to be able to even talk about these ideas in a way that's not quite as black and white as I think it's been addressed so far.
I'm just going to ask quickly because I think it's a related question, and multiple people in the online submissions asked about this. Pointing out that other countries, some of them have women-only cars right on trains, or metro buses, right? And several people asked if there is anything like that in the United States, and whether Metro or other American transit agencies would consider something like that maybe as a way of these issues.
Metro does not have women-only buses or trains. I will speak for me personally. I think when we're talking about sexual harassment, that's generally the reasoning to having these women-only vehicles. Is not eliminated once you get off the train and you're now waiting at the bus stop or waiting on the platform. It's not something that we're currently exploring, and I don't believe there's any agency in the United States that is has a women-only vehicle. Chelsea, do you know?
I'm not aware of that in the United States, but as Gordon alluded in some of our questioners, it certainly does exist in some other countries. I would not call myself a deep expert, but have had a chance to sort of hear a little bit about it. For example, there's a scholar, Ananya Roy, who's now at UCLA, that had looked in India, where they do, in some parts of the country, have women-only cars on the trains. And I think it's a mixed bag, quite honestly. First of all, I've heard that some men go onto those cars because it's a great way to find women to harass. So it's not like it's like 100% safe if you're there. Secondly, a problem is that those often end up being extremely crowded, because of it's hard to, I suppose, know how to equitably distribute the space, but often those end up being far more crowded, so in that maybe I'm not getting groped, but I can't sit, so there are those trade-offs. And I think it also puts sort of the burden on women to keep themselves safe, as opposed to the burden being on kind of all of us as a community to create an environment where people are safe. And then finally, as I point out, men get harassed too, so yes, a women-only car might help women, but it's not helping those people who are not identifying as people.
Other questions from the crowd out there? I see somebody in the back with a microphone.
Hi, Thank you for the presentation. A lot of interesting data. My question kind of consists of three that are all related. That's related to data exploration and data collection. So when you were gathering all this data, what was the main challenges? That's first. Second, if there were tools in your possession that maybe currently not in use, but you can imagine something that would really help, what would it be? And the third, how much do you think we know once you collected this data, how much is still left behind, or something, we don't know what we don't know, but just, if you can guess how much we still didn't capture.
Okay, the main challenges, I would say, as with any data collection effort, you always sort of complete your study and then you're like, I wish I had asked that other thing that I didn't have a chance, that I didn't think to ask. Because we were looking at so many different data sources, sort of sequentially, I think what we really would have loved to be able to do was sort of go back and re-examine some of the things that we had looked at the beginning of the process, after we had done some of the qualitative data. And we tried to do that as best as we could through the process where we were synthesizing and writing the report, but there were still some things that came up that felt like we didn't quite get at the thing that we wanted to hear about through the tools that we used. Tools to help, I think they're, we really leveraged, as you saw, a lot of different data collection methods and data sources. One interesting thing that keeps sort of coming up as a potential data possibility is through automated data collection, through cell phone data. There keeps being sort of like the promise that we'll be able to disaggregate big data by gender and by user type, and I just don't think we're quite there yet, or the permissions and personally identifiable information privacy concerns around using those data to understand more about personal attributes of people are too big, and we haven't quite figured that one out yet. But I think that if we could really, just blow out the sample size and looking at travel patterns and sort of the natural paths that people take, and if we could examine those by gender, that would be really cool. So if anyone knows the data source that is doing that, I'd love to hear about it. And then how much is left behind? One key area that we didn't really get to crack through this study is on the issue of trip chaining. And we looked at trip complexity and variability of destinations and sort of number of trips per day, and I think Elba shared that there's more women than men who take 7 or more trips a day, and more women than men who take 0 trips a day. So we see these sort of like poles of, it's not an extreme effect, but it is there, where women are either hypermobile and responsible for a lot of the care that goes into their household management and the resulting transportation demands on that. And then we also see a lot of women who are not mobile at all. And so to dig into those differences, I think would be really interesting, and then to understand more about the trip chaining for the women who are taking many, many trips per day. How are they doing that? And what are the ways in which, that complicates their life? And are there ways that we could be thinking about simplifying the lives of people who have that really like hypermobility burden on their way that they spend their time?
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm sorry.
I'm just gonna add a few things. One is, I think actually the good news is there's a lot of data out there that we just haven't bothered to look at. So your example that, well, we went back to our passenger surveys and they did ask gender and no one had ever looked at it. And I think that's true in a lot of planning contexts, so that's the good news. There's some money to be collected. I think also, and your, I believe, study does a good example of this, we need a lot of the qualitative work to figure out, like, what are the questions to even ask? Is it about trip changing? Is it about harassment? Is it about strollers? Because there are, some of these things can be added again to just existing data collection processes that the transit agencies are doing anyway. And then finally, the point about also the new technologies, I hear a lot like, well, we just cell phone data, or aside from sort of the technical challenges of that, we don't usually know much about the person. and that's a problem. And even like I've longed for years to get my hand on Clipper card data, that's the transit pass for many of our Bay Area operators. But even there, Clipper, MTC isn't asking people how old are you. We know if they have like a senior card or a youth card, but we don't know their gender. We don't know anything about them. So I don't know if that will ever change. As a professor, I long to have like that data asked. If people would be voluntary when people sign up for a card.
At Metro, we're just starting that with our chat card, where we're going to be asking from some demographic information and gender. Yeah, and again, and that was a recommendation that came out of our council. Say, why don't we know? Because that would probably the only way we really know how people are moving and how many times they're moving a day. So.
And you could so easily then do something like how many women are traveling after 8 o'clock. I mean, it would just be easy to know.
Okay, so I'm told we have maybe 2 questions. I think we should take them together. I'm mindful that at least one of our panelists has a flight. If you two maybe could ask your questions just back to back, and our panelists will respond to kind of both of them as they see fit. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm wondering if you looked at race and ethnicity overlaid on top of the gender aspects, and if you did, if you saw any differences in the way people travel and how they experience transit.
Thank you for your powerful work, and I'll keep this brief. I'm also interested in another dimension of this, which is when you've talked a lot about harassment, but I'm curious, since I did see some mention of kind of non-binary and other sort of gender expression and maybe sort of imputed sexual orientation, whether people talked about being subject to kind of hate speech, hate crimes, other forms of harassment as well. So thank you.
So I think both of those questions really relate to how far were we able to disaggregate the survey and the samples that we collected. So we did look at race and ethnicity, and we did include a couple of snippets within the report for really notable differences. We weren't able to take that sort of multi-dimensional lens to every question that we cover in the report. The report would have gone from 200 pages to 2,000 pages. But all of the data is there, and we did ask about race and ethnicity, so Metro has the data, and if ever they are interested in particularly investigating a specific question or using this data to reinvestigate along race and ethnic lines more deeply, then that's available. The question about gender expression and gender diversity and other forms of harassment on the system, we similarly had some information about non-binary individuals where some of the data that we asked about it in the survey that we did, but some of the pre-existing data, does or doesn't ask about it. What we found was that I believe it was the onboard surveys where it is a category that someone can identify as non-binary. We did see that there was more experiences of sexual harassment among people who identified as non-binary than either men or women. In one of the categories, I can't remember exactly which category, we separated them to physical, verbal, and there's a third category as well. But there was some difference, particularly around the sexual harassment question with people identified as non-binary. It's a pretty small sample size, though, I will say that we didn't run any statistical significance tests on this. And it is a smaller sample size.
And I'll also mention that we did ask about race and ethnicity. It was not the focus. So I think we didn't find huge obvious patterns. I don't think that means there aren't any, by the way, but our survey wasn't catching them. And then we did ask about people's gender identity and also whether they identified as LGBTQI. I think we stopped at I, we missed the A at the end. But so few people self-identified in these ways that we can't really say anything useful. And so to me that points to, at least for gender identity and such, the only way to really learn more, I think, is qualitative methods, because you're just not, you sample 5,000 people, which frankly is hard to do and expensive, you're still likely to end up with so few people in these particular self-identities that you can't really say anything. But if you say interviewed 20 of them, or did focus groups or participant observation, I think we can probably learn a lot.
I think that was one of the opportunities we missed in our participatory workshop. We had 6 different groups that we wanted to talk to. It was about 6, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, just due to time, we weren't able to get to everybody. So that's why we were only able to select 3 that we did. But there was an intention to have a participatory workshop with the community.
All right, well, I would like to point out that there is a sort of opportunity for a networking reception here. There's some food and drink at the back, and we have the room, so maybe an opportunity to ask more questions or mingle or speak with some of our visitors here. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our guests for this incredible report and presentation. One quick announcement.
Just one quick announcement. I work in the Fair Affairs office in Los Angeles. Our Bay Area offices are recruiting. So if there's any students in the room who are interested in internship opportunities, we have a few folks here from our San Francisco and from our San Jose office and from our Bay Area representation. So feel free to come chat with us. Thanks.
Hear that, planning students? All right, well, thank you all again very much for being here. Thanks again to you guys for this wonderful work, for sharing it with us. Thank you so much.